Hi, and welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very fortunate today to be sitting down with Mark Brooks, a man who has many hats, as I just said a minute ago. So yes, Mark, if you'd like to explain a bit about what you do. I know a lot of people know what you do, but there'll be people who don't. So if you would like to explain.
Yeah, I will do. And thank you, Lucy, and welcome everyone who's tuning into this, either watching it or obviously listening to it. So my name is Mark Brooks. So I wear many hats, but primarily I'm the chair of the Mankind Initiative, domestic abuse charity for male victims. We've been running for over 20 years now. We run a national helpline, and also we provide a really good website. We try and get better services for men in their community. And also we lobby the government and other bodies to make sure that they provide better services for men. Interestingly, I'm also chairing a working group across Greater Manchester, working with all the agencies and boroughs to think about how collectively the city of Manchester, or Manchester as a whole, can actually better support male victims. And I'd like to see that replicated in all the other cities around the UK as well. My other hats wear a number. I'm also a trustee of the Men and Boys Coalition, which is a charity, an umbrella charity for organisations and academics and campaigners who are broadly working in the field of men and boys' health and well-being. And also I'm a lead on International Men's Day in the UK, which is a big event every 19th of November, which is Sunday this year. My important message is always that whilst it's the 19th of November, lots of organisations hold events the week before and the week after. So like most guys, you don't stick by the rules. There's always a wiggle room. So it's normally a 2-week period, and you can find information on that on ukmensday.org.uk. So I do all of that, and that's all voluntary work, and then I try and make a living doing communications work for a number of people. So it's pretty busy, but good, more important work.
Absolutely. And that's precisely why we do things like this, isn't it? To get that message out there. And I think to make sure that, like I was just saying to you before, that nobody's left behind, that nobody should ever feel, my biggest thing is always that nobody should ever feel like they've got nowhere to turn. They should always feel like there is somewhere where they can go, where they'll be listened to, no judgment, just supported. And I think that we're far from that in terms of, in general, like you say, it needs to be better and improvements across the board. But something that crosses my mind is how can we, especially with male victims and survivors, how can we encourage them to come forward and to look for support and help? It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because there's a lot of kind of nuances there where, like any victim, there's the shame aspect, there's the not being believed aspect. It's a tough one.
It is a tough one, but it is doable if you put your mind to it. And I think the key thing is looking at things through different lenses. So broadly speaking, what a man goes through is broadly exactly the same as what a woman who is going in a domestic abuse relationship. And that also includes men in same-sex relationships as well as heterosexual relationships, and also in a very overlooked group, in my opinion, women in same-sex relationships which are abusive. I mean, you really don't hear anything about that, and but it's not my area expertise, but I do know that it's just never talked about in any detail. I think the key thing is that for men, there's a number of issues. First of all, they do have this real sense of shame and embarrassment because they're a man. And I know that women will have similar experiences because they're a woman. But in terms of for a man, it really undermines their sense of what it means to be a man. They're meant to be strong and stoical. They're meant to be resilient. And often it can be exacerbated by height differences and size differences, which some people don't really think about. You get a 6'2" guy, 5'6", girlfriend, wife, partner, and that kind of like adds this kind of real sense of shame. But also, I think for men is that they don't really conceptualize, and this is wider issues that I can veer onto all day, but they don't really conceptualize domestic abuse as being domestic abuse in
Mm,
that they recognize the abusive behaviors that they're suffering from. They recognize that they're wrong, but they don't then put two and two together and think,
mm,
wow, that's domestic abuse.
yeah,
'Cause domestic abuse, especially if you're men who are kind of 35 above, where healthy relationships weren't a thing in school, etc.
mm,
Um, domestic abuse was never talked about or touched upon. So there's a kind of real generation issue there. And, what we find is that through our helpline, the majority of the men who call us are 40 plus.
yeah,
Um,
that's
who've
interesting.
been in relationships which have been abusive for some time. Generally speaking, younger people are more likely to be in a abusive relationship than older people or middle-aged people. But the difference is that younger people, I'm generalizing here,
Mm,
don't tend to be married. They won't necessarily have kids. They won't have a mortgage.
yeah,
All of those three factors, when you add that in, as well as the abuse, act as real magnets keeping people in relationships. Makes
absolutely.
it far harder for them to leave. I think the other issues around about men coming forward. So you've got the whole issue about how men view themselves, and that's partly societal. Some of that will be biological as well. I mean, there's an endless debate about how people behave. Is that down to nurture versus nature?
Nature, yeah,
Um, and wherever you sit on the fence, I mean, but there will be biological programmed issues
yeah,
about how uh, um, a boy, men are and boys are naturally like have some of these traits or enhanced traits because a lot of women have them as well.
mm, yeah,
As well as obviously how they're socialized. So it is a combination of them. Boys and girls aren't born like a blank slate from
yeah,
day one. There's biology going on there.
yeah,
But but the other points around kind of societal norms and what you've got is that you've got then what society is like placing on the shoulders of men.
yeah,
And I spoke about the fact that men don't recognize domestic abuse because they've not been brought up to think that they could possibly be a victim of domestic abuse. Certainly, said middle-aged and onwards. But
mm,
also, you've got this what I call a real believability threshold, where men really have to work hard to convince people that
yeah,
they are a victim of domestic abuse because it's counter narrative. And what I mean by that is the narrative in society and from politicians and from some agencies, not all, but on social media and elsewhere, is it's only really heterosexual women who are victims,
mm,
and it's only heterosexual men who are actually perpetrators.
yeah,
So when you've got a man that comes forward, it's kind of counterintuitive. It's like
mm,
countercultural, however you want to dress the words up, because well, you're a man. I've been brought up to think men can't be victims of domestic abuse. So they have to reach a real, what I call this believability threshold. Also, men aren't always believed by friends, family, the police, and others. It's far
mm,
better now than it ever used to be. And also, there's what I would call a lack of, or can be a lack of personal and professional curiosity. Personal, I'm talking about this kind of lack of what I would call spidey sense,
mm,
in that, I mean, if you say you had a daughter or a sister and she's got a new bloke and you haven't seen her for a year when she used to see her all the time, you
mm,
might start to think, well, is this new relationship really good? You know,
mm,
what's happened there? But if you've got a son or a brother in the same scenario, do you think
yeah,
that there's something wrong there as quickly
yeah,
as you would if it was a woman? Now, some people would, some people wouldn't, but certainly, um, from men and women that we've spoken to who've had brothers or sons and others, male friends who've been in domestic abuse relationships. They have kind of thing where I didn't think to ask, or I didn't think anything was wrong. I
Yeah.
hadn't seen him,
Yeah.
I hadn't seen him at the football for a year, etc. And then you've got the professional curiosity where this is more aimed at people like GPs, police officers, people in local councils, employers, for example, thinking, well, there's a man there, he's got physical abuse, bruises. He makes some excuse up. Do they actually say, well, is there anything wrong at home that might have impact on that, rather than saying, oh, it was a DIY accident,
Yeah.
did it playing football or what have you? Or more so, if they're really anxious, if they're suffering from depression,
Yeah.
change of character,
There's signs, isn't
again,
there?
yeah, those kind of signs. I mean, do people think, does the light bulb go off to say, well, I wonder if anything's wrong at home? The
Mm.
other point is that I talk about the societal stuff, is that female perpetrators and male perpetrators of it, but female perpetrators will use reverse psychology. So they'll use that narrative to say, well, there's no point you telling anybody, no one's going to believe you, you're a man. If you tell anybody, well, I'll just tell them you're the one doing it, because
Yeah.
men don't do this. And then you get other things about, well, what type of man are you if you're actually letting me walk all over you, etc. So
Yeah.
this is kind of like perpetrators using that narrative. The last areas, and I could go on for ages, Lucy, is that there's a real lack of what I'd call public story.
Mm.
I talked about the narrative being very much female victim, male perpetrator, and that's really enhanced by you've got government policy, which is then transmitted down to local councils and police forces, that says that all victims of domestic abuse are victims of violence against women and girls, which is obviously, just unacceptable, in that if you're a male victim of domestic abuse, you're not a woman.
Mm.
But according to the government, you are.
Yeah.
So a male victim of domestic abuse, or a boy who's sexually abused, or if you've got a gay man fleeing a forced marriage, they're all described by the government as being a victim of violence against a woman or a girl. A sexually abused boy is not a girl.
No. And that's
You know,
coming from
that's national government. That is
Yeah.
national government. And what we and other organisations have been saying, look, we need to keep the violence against women and girls strategy, because why would you get rid of that?
Yeah.
And we do need to focus on that area, and we need better support for women and girls. But you can't have men under that. So
Yeah.
we've been calling for a parallel strategy. But what it means is that when the government say we've got these great new domestic abuse initiatives, they come under the violence against women and girls, and then I say, does that include men and boys? They go, oh yeah, it does. They said, yeah, but they're not women and girls. Why
Yeah.
is 2023? It's Orwellian. It's like, you can't say you support men and boys, and then on one hand,
not
and then on
support
the
them.
other hand, calling them women and girls. It's
Mm.
just, my views with government and other people's views of the government are that. But the reason I say that is that then adds these other barriers about, we're talking about how we can get more men to talk about it, more
Yeah.
people to believe and come forward, because all of these things act as barriers to stop that. So we need society to recognize male victims in exactly the same way as it recognizes female victims. And we also need government and local authorities to kind of remove men and boys from women and girls strategies and have their own.
Yeah.
The last point is that we do need better campaigning, and a lot of websites and a lot of domestic abuse organisations aren't always as explicit as they ought to be, that they do actually support men and boys. And I think and the key thing is on communications is a number of things. You have to be, for men, you have to describe the behaviours, and then say this is domestic abuse. So I've seen some great posters where it said, you know, my girlfriend hasn't allowed me to see my friends for a year. I'm always being monitored. Why is my girlfriend always, or wife always hitting me, etc.? And then men and boys will then think, and then you say this is domestic abuse, and then you have to say call this number to get help.
Yeah.
But also you have to be explicit, because one of the things that I've said, and this is where my kind of professional comms hat is, that there's no point saying if you're a domestic abuse victim, get help by ringing this number, because men won't think that's for them. But if you said if you're a woman or a man who is a victim of domestic abuse, ring this number, men will call it because they see the word man or male.
Yeah.
But unless those words are there, men won't think it applies to them.
No.
So how do we get them societal change and better signposting and more awareness, better communication campaigns for men, and also that reassurance of anonymity where necessary, and also the confidence that actually they'll be believed and taken seriously.
That's the next thing, isn't it? It's the moving, you know, coming forward is one thing, but what happens then? You know, once you've come forward, once you're trusting somebody with your story, well, if it doesn't go anywhere, then, you know, what have you done it for, kind of thing? You know, if it is something that needs to be passed on to other, like you say, authorities, whoever, then that's, you know, where I always think, especially if a male victim, like we were saying before about believability, if a male victim doesn't connect the dots and realize that it is abuse, like you say, then they're not going to believe it themselves. They'll just think, well, that's the behavior that she, you know, displays in our relationship or whatever. And they're not necessarily going to believe it themselves. And that makes me wonder then, like you say, like society, it's societal. Is it education kind of earlier? You know, when you're saying obviously generations didn't have the healthy relationships conversation and discussion in schools, that how can we open that conversation up and say, actually, you know, younger than that, younger than secondary, you do have a right to have boundaries in place if you don't want to, you know, do something or whatever, and, you know, not being, you know, feeling like you're forced into a situation. And that's, you know, like I say, and a lot of behaviors learned from home or whatever things you see, like you say, nature versus nurture. But it makes me wonder if, you know, do we need to look at it, because we're all, you know, we all talk about a lot of things, but that to me is something that, you know, younger generations, much younger generations need to have some kind of understanding about, because we're sort of teaching kids in school and saying, well, if somebody says sorry, you forgive and move on. You know, a lot of people will, in a relationship, an abusive relationship, that the abuser says, I'm sorry, you know, I've had a bad day, I didn't mean it, it'll never happen again, and we move on. You know, it's almost breaking that cycle, isn't it? And how do we get that message out there in terms of education? It's scary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think education is clear, but, you know, my issue is always making sure that actually what is being taught in schools is aimed at making sure that obviously men don't, you know, commit abuse against other men or women, but also is being 100% clear that for girls as well, that it's unacceptable for them in terms of boys' relationships. And, you know, I mean, I have a, you know, a general, you know, issue about some of the narrative around boys. It's like only boys actually commit abuse, and it's only really against other girls. I mean, my always contention is that with some of this, is that, girls don't bully girls now? Is that in the playground or on social media? Is that no longer a thing anymore? And then when I talk to you know, nieces and others, and they say, oh no, it's that happens.
It's probably worse than ever, to be honest.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, I mean, but you know, that just never get. I mean, where do you hear about clampdown on girls not bullying other girls and boys? I mean, you never hear that.
Yeah.
So we've got to be 360 on this, because also it's really important for boys not to feel that they're being picked on as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? And
that's the hard thing, isn't it, as well? You know, when you're looking at what society is throwing out there in terms of role models, it's so hard, isn't it? I mean, I'm fortunate enough that with my own children, I'm quite honest with them, and there's that two-way respect. Whereas the generation before would have said, what do you mean you're respecting your 16-year-old son? What do you mean? Well, no, it is a two-way street. I'm not right all the time. I'm human. I can make mistakes. I'm not perfect as a parent, but having that conversation saying, okay, so what do you want at this? I think that's one of the biggest things, I think, in a survey that came out a while ago was what teenagers, boys and girls, what they want more than anything is to be respected. And I think a lot of the time people find that so hard to understand. Well, why do we need to respect them, the teenagers? But if we don't give that trust and understanding, then they're not going to come forward and talk about things. They're not going to feel that they, because trust is such a huge element when it comes to abuse anyway, isn't it? It's such a huge element to be able to trust somebody with your story if you've never told it before. And also, if you don't even realize, sometimes you're processing it yourself as you're talking about it because it hasn't hit you, that actually, oh, hang on a minute, all these things that are happening. Yeah, that's it. And that's where I think you're right. The campaigning needs to be a lot better, and it needs to be more obvious that men can be victims as well. Male victims are out there and they need the support, and there needs to be the campaigns. And that's, like I say, I mean, hopefully this is what I want for the website, is inclusion of everybody. It probably is a bit of a pipe dream, but that's the world I would like to live in, is that everybody feels, nobody's story is, they're all different stories and they're all unique to that person. And everybody should feel that they have that validate. I think that's a huge part of validation as well. I keep coming back to the moment when people are saying about the website, I love it, I feel validated. Well, yeah, you should feel validated. You have every right to say that this is something that has happened and it is wrong, and now I need to try. And I always find recovery a really hard word as well, because a lot of the time for people, what I often say is it's not a cough or cold. You've not got the flu and all of a sudden somehow, hey presto, you're going to recover. It is a process of moving forward every day. And you could have days where actually, do you know what? I feel on top of the world and it's great. And then something will happen and you'll feel like you're right back to square one. And that's where the support needs to be, better understood, and where employers, society in general needs to understand it isn't something that there's no expiration date on how long it takes you to move forward, I always think. And
absolutely.
And that needs to be there in terms of the support and campaigns. So hopefully one day we might get there.
Well, I hope so. Well, we are moving there. I always kind of say, well, things never move as fast as you ever want them to, but we're in a better place than we were 5-10 years ago.
Yeah.
Certainly with regard to male victims. I've been involved for 15 years, just over now, and there was literally nothing for male victims. There wasn't any recognition anywhere. There wasn't any services for male victims, really. And now there is support in every community across the UK for male victims. Partly, that's been helped by things like the Equality Act, because that's meant that councils can't commission a domestic abuse service that doesn't support everybody in the community. Whereas beforehand, there used to be just for female victims or just heterosexual female victims. And I used to stay up endless nights. I have to bribe my wife with a curry every Saturday night to keep marriage together. The reason for that is because I would be spending endless nights just sending off letters to councils. I'm on some system where you get to see all the contracts that councils commission, and I've got like domestic abuse as a kind of search term, and I still look at it, but what I used to do is get all of these. I'd get these email alerts and I'd see them saying domestic abuse service in X council. We're spending 5 million over 3 years to support women in domestic in our community. And I go, right, well, that's great, right and proper. And I'd look through the tender. And so there's no mention men, and then other aspects, LGBT plus and whatever. And people from an ethnic background, etc. No reflection of that. And then I'd write to the leader of the council and say, you're in breach of the Equality Act and a couple of other laws. Do you want to think about making sure that you're supporting men and these other groups? And and then things would change. I mean, to be fair, the councils weren't doing it on purpose,
No.
so they just weren't thinking. So I'd be helping them think, but I'd be up also, like, oh God, there's another two. I've got to find the leader of the council on the website. I've got to send a letter off. Then I've got to log it to make sure I get reply and all of that. I mean, I still do a lot of that. I mean, I wrote to 35 police and crime commissioners in February because I was worried about some wording from government about new police strategy, which didn't include men. It had a new violence against women and girls policing strategy. It was all great. And then it didn't mention the word men and boys. So I wrote to them all saying, you do realise it's meant to include men and boys. And they all said, yes, it does. Yeah, they realise that. And, then I was saying to the government, why didn't you even just put the word that this includes men and boys in this? Like, what is your problem?
What's
with
the issue?
writing something so simple? I mean, so I'm still writing snotty letters or polite.
Still find the courage.
Yeah. To be fair, they weren't snotty letters, but they were very constructive letters because it's not there.
And just factual as well.
I'm still writing letters, polite but firm letters, but not as many as they used to, and that's the sign. I'm not writing letters to councils anymore.
Yeah,
which is a blessing.
Yeah, it'll save your sanity.
Yeah, obviously I rafted them.
That is the thing, though, isn't it? I mean, if we're in a position where those who are kind of holding the pots, if you like, to put the campaigns out there, the sport out there, then that's frightening, because this is where everybody has a right to that support. There is nobody ever that should ever feel like they can't find support. And this is, again, so what I want to do as well with the resources page, when you were just saying then before about the International Men's Day, is things like that on the resources page. I just want it full to the brim. I know I've got Mankind Initiative on there, but as many as possible to say, this is where you can. I don't care. It doesn't matter that it's, it doesn't have to necessarily be like a national one. It can be one in a county town somewhere. It doesn't matter to me, because everybody needs that support from somewhere. And sometimes it can be quite intimidating looking at a national, like you say, national helpline number, thinking, oh my God, this has been recorded or whatever. It's difficult. So I think having a resources page where there's everything on there, and eventually I'd like to do one when I get a minute, but I'm one person doing all this, is, events that are coming up, if there are events coming up, that kind of thing to get the message out there. But I think until the mindset can change, that you hear the words domestic abuse and people just go, oh, don't want to talk about that, don't want to get involved, don't understand it, don't want to understand it, then, but you're right, things have changed. We're now getting male refuges opening up, and support groups for men, and it's fantastic because and another thing that gets me as well is, we were talking before about the believability, is so often a perpetrator is in a professional role, and that makes it really difficult, because it comes across that, well, they're professionals, therefore, but they're just hiding in plain sight. You add that onto a male victim as well, that the perpetrator that they are, involved with in the relationship, that person has a very successful role or is considered in their, field of expertise, whatever it is, to be this kind of guiding light. Then how on earth could you possibly believe that she could be like that? Or, we could go on all day, couldn't we? I think.
Yeah, we could. I mean, just but it's all right. I mean, it's but I mean, there's a couple of points there, Lucy. I mean, the issue about websites really important, because a lot of men really fear this whole issue around anonymity and confidentiality, especially when it comes to initial help seeking. And that isn't just about kind of domestic abuse, that's in lots of men's health settings. So that's why, having information on websites is absolutely vital. And what you will find is that a lot of guys will go on websites, they will find the information they need, and they will go about acting upon that information, contacting other organizations without you even knowing about it. Men also they don't like the state. you know, again, it's like sometimes you get people, why didn't they come to domestic abuse service? Like, well, men don't like the state. Yeah, a lot of men just don't want state interfering in their lives.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just me, but I mean, you know, it's sort of like, but also that's why having that information is really important, and also having information about what, you know, what is domestic abuse.
Yeah.
It's really, really important. Also, another thing that's really important is always about making sure there's information available where men go, not where you think they should go.
Yeah.
So certainly, as I said, I talk about websites. Facebook is really important, but also barbers, gyms, sports clubs, pubs, industrial estates, all sorts of places. I mean, I've always said if you think you're putting leaflets up in GP surgeries or libraries or community centres, it's like, yeah, job done. It's not a job.
Yeah, sorted.
So I'm not saying it's a place for women either, but you know, it's where men go, not where you think they should
Where
go.
you think,
And I mean the other point in terms of what you were talking about, what was your last point, Lucy? I've talked too much. I'm sort of forgot
I'm trying to remember. I'm
now.
trying to remember what I said now. I said that much. I was talking about the believability. I was talking about the, do you know what? I don't even know. I've said that much. I've said that much.
It's all right. You can leave this in the edit. It doesn't matter. You can show that this is as live.
No, it's
But
honest.
but that's really important. Is about where do men go, and giving them that confidence that they will be taken seriously. The other thing is men. You know, men are practical people, so they want to know what to do, but also they need to know there's hope. One of the things, the important things on we've got loads of case studies and things on our website, involved in lots of videos and things, and it's really important for guys to think that there is a way out. Because I get men writing to me saying I'd love to be featured on your website. Obviously, we change names and things.
Yeah.
Or I'd like to speak to the media about X, Y, and Z. And then when I say, well, are you still going through are you still in the relationship, or how far out of the relationship? And it's kind of like, oh no, I'm still in the relationship, or you know, I'm still just dealing with it. And I'm like, you know, and there's endless family court battles, etc. And I'm like, you've got to give guys hope. So they need to know how you got into the situation, because that kind of relates. What's going on in the situation, because that relates to their experience. And then how you got out of it and how you're doing now. And they've all got, the last 2 points have to be positive, because you've got to give guys hope. Because if you say, oh, I'm in this relationship and it's still really bad, and I haven't seen my kids for 10 years. It's like, well, that's not going to help guys going through your situation get their head straight.
Yeah, and that's another point. Just when you were saying that, then it made me think. I think what a lot of people don't understand as well is sometimes people choose to stay. Like you say, it may be because they think, I'm not going to see my kids again, or finances. You know, you own a house together or whatever. I'm going to end up with nothing. You know, and I think that's one thing that drives me insane when people say, well, why don't you just leave? It isn't that straightforward. And I think that's when I did a podcast with Sam Fisher, that's one of the things we talked about, was it is never as straightforward as just leaving. And some people choose it, and some people do leave and then end up going back to the perpetrator, because they're actually thinking, you know, better the devil you know, in some ways, because, well, at least I saw my kids, at least I had, you know, a certain amount of, you know, contact or whatever. But I think that's the real kind of difficulty that I always think. And a lot of the time, so you leave, okay, so you've left, but then more often than not, the abuser will ramp up the control. Then they will, you know, it actually more often than not gets worse in my experience and kind of cases I've seen, is it is a sense of, you've left, but actually this is now going to get worse for you, and nobody prepares anybody for that. You know what I mean? That kind of conversation needs to be had as well, that, okay, you have left, but we need to talk about the fact that, okay, so you have children, so this, you know, give them the understanding that things may happen. It's not saying it will happen, but more often than not with somebody that, you know, leaves a situation, if a victim manages to leave, that very, very often it can get a lot worse for them. And I know there's no way of preparing for that, because mentally, you know, and physically and emotionally, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. No, it's an absolute marathon. So, but it's how do we, you know, if we had more campaigns, we could talk about things like that, couldn't we? And say, okay, so it won't be easy. No one's saying it's going to be a walk in the park, but there is help out there. There is support out there, and you have got hope, you know. That to me, you're right. Hope is, to me, is the biggest part of all of it. It's just knowing that it can get better. It may take time. It may take a lot of support in various guises, but you know, you will eventually get there. You just need to know that people do care, and people are passionate, and people are not judging you. You know, just because you're male does not mean that you cannot be a victim. And I think if that kind of message, and like I say, well, hopefully that's what we're talking about with the website, the resources page. I just want it to be off the charts with as many resources as possible, you know, so people know where to go and then know where to go. So
yeah. Well, exactly. And you know, building on that and segueing back to the point that I'd forgotten about and now I've remembered.
yay.
As well, but it leads on to that. I mean, it was about the kind of stereotypes of the different roles or different
Yes.
socioeconomic backgrounds, and it is right. I mean, we get calls to our helpline, and I'm sure the other charities, you know, Sam, you mentioned it, a Trafford Domestic Abuse Service, you know, they will be, and we do get calls from GPs, we get calls from bankers, accountants, you know, high end type roles, as well as men, you know, who are unemployed or men in trades, and all sorts of men. But I mean, there was a case that came out earlier this year in March, where the lady went to prison actually.
Yes, I remember
Called
seeing that.
Richard
Yeah.
Spencer, and they lived in a 7-bedroom house in York or outside of York, and you know, he and her are kind of like very good jobs, etc. And then you know that happens, and she's in prison now, and there's quite a few other cases similar to that. So again, it's not just about the stereotypes about men; it's about getting around the stereotypes about what type of man. And so that's really important, those stereotypes, which is why we need that more publicity. I mean, you often don't. I mean, one area, you know, nearly all, I'm thinking now, nearly all of the cases that I know of that have ever reached the papers, they're always white men. I'm just trying to think. You know, I can't recall, unless I'm happy to be proven wrong. I'd like to be proven wrong, but I can't recall causes of kind of, or cases where I've seen, you know, men who are black or men from an Asian background. You know, I don't see in a domestic abuse relationship. I've not seen. I was thinking about it the other day. Actually, I've not seen cases like that at all. All the ones that ever reached the courts broadly are white men, and
Oh, that's
you
interesting.
know, and so, and you know, I know that domestic abuse will be going on in all different types
Absolutely.
of male communities.
Communities, and yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and ethnicities and people who are disabled or not, etc. And yeah, so you know, I do worry about the lack of men from certain communities actually coming forward as well.
Yeah, that's so true. And again, you know, we think we're sort of, and we are in some ways getting there, but there's so much more to do, you know, to get that kind of message out there that whoever you are, there is that support. But then maybe, like you say, you know, why don't they come forward? There's a million reasons probably, you know, and that's something that needs to change.
Yeah, it does. And then there was some interesting research from the Domestic Abuse Commissioner that came out in, when did it come out? The end of last year. And it was very good research. about kind of postcode lottery and a
Yeah.
lot of, and it showed that a lot of men, 80% of men who had been victims, said that they found it either very difficult or difficult to get
Mm.
support. But one of the things was interesting about the reasons why they stayed in an abusive relationship, and the priority for men was to actually help their female partner.
Right.
It was
Yeah.
really interesting, and it wasn't quite the same for women. I think for women, the most popular one was to protect the children.
Mm.
That was still high for men as well.
Mm.
But I found that fascinating. There was a clear gender split in that. I mean, most of the answers were the same, but there was a clear gender split in that. And, you know, that whole issue around, again, words that, or things that often are not, you know, not politically correct in some respects, you know, how aspects around male chivalry,
Mm.
which don't, you know, it's almost become taboo to even talk about it.
Mm.
But the thing was, when I saw that stat, and I'd seen it elsewhere, and I've seen it with other men as well, talking to me about that, it's like, well, you know, you're a victim of abuse, and your first thought is, how can I support my perpetrator to
Yeah.
change her ways?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it's that was a really distinct gender dynamic that really stood out. And yeah, yeah, and that must be kind of like real chivalry, you know, not
Thinking that, yeah.
myself first, you know, putting the
Yeah.
other person first, women and children type first. As I said,
Mm.
it's not really an area that gets talked about, but that can be the only reason, that whole sense of male chivalry.
That they feel, and you know, just that was making me think then about, for example, if the man is the carer, you know, as we
Yeah,
all get older, we all unfortunately start dropping off, and we all, you know, things happen, and unfortunately sometimes, especially as we do get a lot older, we need more support, we need more help, and there's that guilt factor, isn't there? You know, well, I can't leave her now, she's, you know, she needs my support, she needs my care, and it does put a lot of pressure then on the victim to feel like they have to stay, you know,
yeah,
because what will society think if they leave? Well, you left that person and they were, you know, severely ill, or they were needing your support, you know, because they're going through a lot of medical problems, and that is so difficult. I think if we, you know, if we get to a point where we don't, it's funny, isn't it, as a person, I'm talking about myself now, but in my mid-40s, I care very little about what people think anymore, you know,
yeah,
and I do think that's an age factor, isn't it? I care very little. And I think if we could all get to that stage a bit more in terms of not caring about what somebody else thinks of us, then maybe we would feel that we could go and find support, you know, and again, it's changing that mindset, isn't it? That, well, what will people think? Well, it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. That's one thing I've tried to put on the website, like top tips and trying to, you know, helpful little things like that, saying it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks of you. It really doesn't, because you can't control what somebody else thinks of you. They're going to think it regardless of, you know, whether you get the support or you don't get the support. They're going to think whatever they're going to think. So you can't change somebody's opinion. That's their opinion. And the more you realize that it doesn't matter, the freer you are to then go and get that support. And there's another campaign.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Not caring about what people think.
Yeah, I think you and I, Lucy, need to like knock on some doors to get some big budgets and say,
Yes,
like, big budgets. Give it, you know, we'll do massive communication campaigns for you.
let's
So
do it. I'd love that.
yeah, let's do that.
We'll start planning that now.
Yeah,
Get
exactly.
some plenty of campaigns going. Well, I was going to say, so normally what I would do is ask the questions, but I think we've covered them about the how can we break down the barriers? Why do we find it hard to talk about? I think we've pretty much covered it in everything we've talked about, and then a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the key thing is for guys, you know, the message I always say is that, you know, you're not weak and you're not alone,
Yeah.
and you're not to blame. But you know, there's hundreds and hundreds of guys going through this right now, but also there's hundreds and hundreds of guys who are either leaving or making the plans to leave and working it out. So you know, so for any men listening to this, you know, there is hope. You can get out of these situations, and that's, you know, really important to be clear. But also, it's always about, you know, I come back to that point. People have to look out for men better. I mean, I've been doing some wider work on men's health, male suicide, unconnected to domestic abuse. Although there is a connection, but
Yeah.
the work I'm doing is not like domestic abuse and
Solely. No.
men's mental health totally. And the key thing is that society just needs to care about men and boys a bit more than it currently does. And I think at an institutional level, we see this a lot where there's big campaigns and men and boys aspects are relegated or are not front and center. And I think we need to change, because I think there's a bigger issue about how men and boys are not being recognized when they need support.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And like you say, it's that care aspect, isn't it? For them to know that actually they are as important, and any experience that they've had, it's vital in terms of as addressing the issue. If they are coming forward more and it is being reported more, then it can only do good in the sense of any kind of change. But I think there's so many other factors, isn't there, that we need to change, and slowly it is getting there. But I do think there's a long way to go. But hopefully, like I say, if men can sort of listen to things like this, watch it, and realize as well. And also the other aspect is, I'm a woman, you're a man, and we can have this conversation, and it doesn't end in it's two people understanding that this is important, and this is important on a massive level for everybody. So if we can do it, other people should be able to do it as well, and appreciate that, male victims are out there and they do need that support and they do need that help. And there is hope. And I love that, because one of the things I always say is you're not alone, because it is the most frightening place to be, I think, and the scariest place to be is feeling you've got nowhere to turn. That is terrifying, and no one should feel like that, definitely not. But I think we've done quite well there. I'm rather pleased with this.
Yeah, it's been really, really enjoyable, and I'm always happy to chat. I just talk on for ages about anything, really.
We'll start working on budgets and campaigns, and
that's right.
We'll be ruling the world next.
Yeah, so C.I.C and C.I.C, watch out! Here we come.
Here we come.
Lucy and Mark Incorporated.
I love that. We'll make it happen. I'm convinced of it. Yeah. Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'm going to make sure that the resources page, we keep going, we keep adding more support services on there, more links, so that people can go out there, men can, and boys, anybody can go out there and get that support that they need. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure, Lucy. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.